All right, this is lecture 15.5, Roots of Revolution. During the age of old imperialism, nations like Portugal had begun trading in India and Southeast Asia. The Portuguese were also interested in trading with the Chinese. Why? Well, foreigners had long been interested in Chinese silk, porcelain, tea, and many other Chinese products. However, throughout history, the Chinese had long been placing limits on foreign trade. This included the Ming emperors from the Ming dynasty during the mid to late 1400s. The Qing dynasty, or Qing dynasty, in the 1700s also limited foreign trade in China. However, the Qing dynasty began to decline, which will usher in an era of European influence across China. So why did the Qing dynasty decline? Well, there were two reasons. First, the peasants were unhappy about high taxes and their inability to own land. With frequent famines, the peasants began to revolt against Qing leaders. Secondly, beginning in the late 1700s, we're going to see Europe undergo the Industrial Revolution. This is going to help drive an era of new imperialism and the desire to open marketplaces around the globe. The nation most interested in trading with China? I'll give you a hint. The sun never sets on the... Yep, that's right. Great Britain set its sights on China. Would it become a colony of the British Empire like other nations we've been discussing in class? Not exactly. Stay tuned. As the British industrialized and began colonizing around the globe, they refused to kowtow or bow low to the Chinese emperors. Foreigners were asked to bow to the Chinese emperors upon visiting the nation to show their inferiority. Europeans no longer wanted trade restrictions that only allowed them to trade in 2 cities in China. The British demanded that the Chinese open trade to Europeans. The Chinese emperors refused. So how on earth do you get a nation that doesn't want to trade with you to trade with you? Well, perhaps you introduce them to a drug, a narcotic, right? You could introduce them to a product that they simply can't live without, something they start to depend on, something you have plenty of from your other colonies. So what could the British use to persuade them? Well, the answer, like I said before, opium. It's a narcotic. See, poppy plants were widely grown across South Asia, and although India didn't officially become a British colony until the mid-1800s, there was still much influence there under the British East India Company. Remember? Poppies are used to make opium, an addictive drug. Other drugs that can be made from poppy plants include heroin. By the 1800s, the British had managed to introduce the highly intoxicating narcotic called opium to the Chinese, and the demand surged. The Chinese government attempted to stop this illegal drug trade unsuccessfully, using diplomatic means. When you are diplomatic or engage in what is known as diplomacy, you are discussing a problem civilly in order to reach an amicable resolution or compromise. When it became clear the British were unwilling to stop the sale of opium in China, violence broke out. The Chinese attacked a British shipment of opium in 1839, which led to a series of battles called the Opium War. The British were able to defeat the Chinese using a superior military and modern technology. The Opium War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing. This was an unequal treaty that forced the Chinese to make certain concessions or allowances to the British. The first concession? Well, the emperor agreed to pay for the destroyed opium. The second concession? Great Britain took control of the island of Hong Kong, which remained in their control until 1997. It also opened up British trade in other Chinese ports. Pretty soon, there was a mad dash by other European nations to establish trade in China, as well as forcing unequal treaties on the Chinese. Western nations also won the right to something called extraterritoriality, which is simply a fancy term that means that local rules or laws don't apply to you. Under extraterritoriality, Westerners in China didn't have to obey Chinese laws, and they could play by their own rules. Even if they broke a Chinese law, they couldn't be prosecuted by the Chinese. So, Did China get colonized like other parts of the world during the age of new imperialism? No, actually. In China, it was a bit different. See, China experienced what we call economic imperialism. Western nations controlled trade throughout China, but they never colonized the nation. China still had its own government, but they had to obey the unequal trading treaties with the Western nations. Soon, Western nations began arguing with each other over who could trade in different parts of China. European nations established what became known as spheres of influence. Spheres of influence are areas where a foreign nation has special trading or economic privileges. Foreign nations who have a sphere of influence in another country can pretty much do what they want in a certain area, like build factories and railroads. There were many areas under foreign economic spheres of influence by nations which included Great Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. Seeking to become a major player in the sphere of influence game, the Americans also tried to institute something called the open door policy on China, which was meant to help protect its own trade with China. Under the open door policy, the U.S. called for equal access to China. They weren't successful, but it did ensure that the U.S. would engage in some trade with the Chinese. The Chinese, however, resented all of this foreign influence in their nation, and there were many attempts by the Chinese to rid China of foreign influence. The most famous of these attempts was perhaps the Taiping Rebellion, which was an uprising of peasants beginning in 1851. Over the course of 14 years, over 20 million Chinese peasants died. The Qing dynasty crushed this opposition with force, allowing foreign influence to continue. Many Chinese wanted to modernize their nation in order to rid themselves of foreign influence. Chinese reformers attempted to make technological advances, all while preserving traditional Chinese culture. In 1898, the government established the 100 Days of Reforms, an attempt to modernize and change China. Young men were sent abroad to learn Western ways and to study. Factories were built. The Chinese civil service exam was updated, and Western-style schools were set up. One of the most famous reformers was the young Chinese emperor at the time named Guangxi. However, many Chinese opposed this reform and felt that the adoption of Western ideas and technology threatened traditional Chinese life. The former emperor's widow, Cixi, opposed Guangxi's reforms and seized power away from the young emperor. Another event that showed China was unwilling to accept foreign influence was the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The Boxers were anti-foreign fighters who formed an organization called Fists of Righteous Harmony. In 1900, the Boxers began attacking and killing foreigners throughout China. An international coalition of forces was put together to fight the Boxers. The result was that foreign nations put troops on the ground in China, ensuring that there would be a foreign military presence in the nation. The final reform made by the Chinese was a government one. In 1911, a revolution occurred. After the death of Empress Cixi, China declared itself a republic, and President Sun Yat Sen from a newly formed political party called the Kuomintang, also known as the Nationalist Party, took power. Sun Yat-sen came to power briefly as their new president. The government was a bit disorganized and it lacked power over the population. From 1911 to 1928, China is going to suffer from a state of near civil war. Well, Sun Yat-sen attempted to reform China by instituting his 3 principles of the people. First, he called for nationalism and an end to foreign domination. Secondly, he called for a representative or democratic government. And third, he wanted to make sure everybody had a job. He wanted to ensure a stable life for all Chinese. Sun Yat-sen never had a chance to implement this plan, and he was ousted from office in 1912. However, he still helped lead the nationalists for years afterwards, and he had a huge following of supporters who believed in his 3 principles of the people. Soon, China was in a state of civil war, which, like I said, continued until 1928. From 1928 until 1949, the Nationalist Party will battle with a new political party for power. This new party was the Communist Party. Sun Yat-sen had named a leader for the nationalist-led army. His name was Chiang Kai-shek. He's also known in history by the name Chiang Ji-shi. Most modern textbooks have begun using Jiang Zishi, also spelled as Chiang Zishi, in lieu of Chiang Kai-shek. It's considered more politically correct. So why so many spellings in English? Well, think about it. We're using our own alphabet to represent phonetic sounds of Chinese characters. Many Chinese phonemic sounds don't exist in the English language, so we have to do our best to spell these out and pronounce them. Get it? Anyway, Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Zishi, will take over the leadership of the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, in 1925. By 1928, Chiang Kai-shek controlled all of China under the Nationalist Party. However, many people in China were unhappy with the nationalist rule. There were economic problems throughout the country, and the Nationalist Party continued to allow for much foreign influence in China. Most Chinese lived in abject poverty. There was a huge difference between the rich and the poor. The Chinese Communist Party was very appealing to the poor Chinese masses, who were promised land redistribution and economic equality by the communists. More and more people began supporting the Communist Party. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek and his army attempted to rid China of the Communist Party. They were killed or expelled from the nationalist government. The surviving communists fled to the mountains. A new leader emerged in the late 1920s and early 1930s to lead the Communist Party. Mao Zedong won widespread support throughout China by appealing to the peasants. Soon, peasants were joining Mao's growing army. The nationalists immediately engaged in a drive to rid China of the communists. In 1934, the communists trekked across China to escape from the nationalist army. Their journey was over 6,000 miles long, and it lasted about a year. This event became known as the Long March. 90,000 Chinese communists began this journey, but only 7,000 survived. It looked like the Communist Party would be wiped out. But in 1937, the Japanese attacked a province of China called Manchuria. And both the communists and the nationalists will set aside their differences momentarily to fight the Japanese during World War II. However, by the end of World War II, the communists and nationalists were once again at odds with each other. The Chinese communists were able to gain power in 1949. Mao will rule China from 1949 to 1976. But more on all that later. Thanks for listening. Bye.